There was certainly at one point when several of the newspapers, including the Sun and the News of the World, monstered me big time at the end of 2003 when it felt very lonely. And I remember a journalist saying to me, "We will have killed you by Christmas," but I still seem to be here. So you know, politics, you have to have a thin enough skin to be available and open to what's going on around you. Otherwise you become useless, but you've got to have a thick enough skin to be able to survive when people start throwing darts at you.
Yeah, but a lot of politicians, colleagues, are scared because they are so ferocious. They are out to damage you.
Well, yes, and the truth is you could monster anybody. You know, you could monster Mother Teresa or the Pope, and in fact, of course, people do. But you know, newspapers are just newspapers. That's all they are. And they don't have the power that they did 20, 30 years ago either now, because I think people frame their opinions. Often they frame them much faster, which can be hateful and spiteful, but it sometimes means that they change their mind in 48 hours as well.
2009 was the first time we actually learned about the extent of the phone hacking scandal through The Guardian, but still for years nothing really happened. Was that frustrating?
Tom Watson and I knew, another Labour MP and I, we knew a lot of the stuff that was happening. I knew because I was one of the people that had their phone hacked, and I, along with others, was suing both the Metropolitan Police to say that they should be contacting all the victims, and suing newspapers who own the News of the World. And so we knew a lot of stuff, but we couldn't quite prove it, and that certainly felt frustrating. But also, it almost inevitably, most people weren't really interested in the story when it was just about a few politicians and celebrities, and it completely changed its nature when people realised that, you know, even the Millie Dowler, a young girl who disappeared, they'd hacked into her phone and they deleted messages from her answer phone, which led the family to believe that she was still alive, which just seemed pretty despicable. And that's when there was the kind of national sense of revulsion.
When that story broke, did you know straight away, okay, now it's all going to change?
I think Tom and I knew some time before about the Millie Dowler involvement, and we always knew that if that were stood up by the police, then that would be something of a breaking point, except that there are many, many other cases which are hideous as well. And it's worth pointing out, for me, part of the invidiousness of the Murdoch involvement in the United Kingdom is that they not only own 40% of the national newspapers, but they also own a large share of the pay TV market. In fact, Sky B, largely owned by the Murdochs, has 80% of pay TV in the United Kingdom. And in my constituency, for a long time, you could only get BBC even by paying Murdoch. So that sense of monopoly and the stranglehold on British society, I think, was really dangerous. And one of the scandals is that the News of the World were hacking the phone of Tessa Jowell, who was the minister in charge of broadcasting and newspapers. So, I mean, that is political corruption at its worst.
If that was a company hacking another company, what would have happened?
Exactly, that kind of industrial espionage, you know, people would be going to court and paying an awful lot of money. And in the end, of course, the worst thing is that it's not just that there was the original criminality at the News of the World, which might in the individual case lead to a jail sentence of up to 2 years. It's also the paying of police officers, the collusion with the police officers, and the managed cover-up, the pretense for years and years and that it was just one rogue newspaper journalist that was involved in it all, and the criminal charges that may now be laid, including, you know, perverting the course of justice and perjury, could see people in jail for up to 5, 7 or 10 years.
How's the post-Murdoch era going to look like? Or is it maybe too early to speak of a post-Murdoch era?
Well, you know, we in Britain like Shakespeare, and Shakespeare wrote 5-act plays, and I think we're only in Act 3 at the moment. We've not yet we're just at the interval. What we still have to see is what charges are laid by the police against these 12 people who've been arrested, and there may be others as well. So far we don't know of any of the police officers who were paid for information and what's going to happen to them. There's still the so there's still more elements of the criminal investigation into the hacking of computers as well. So there's a lot yet still to see, I think.
Yeah, but how will a summer party for Mr. Murdoch next year look like?
I suspect he won't be having a summer party next year. Be all a bit quiet and subdued, and there may not even be big events at all the party conferences this autumn. But I have a real worry, which is at the moment we have 8 national daily newspapers. I can't see that we're going to have 8 in 3 years' time. The Times looks, very in a difficult position. It's losing money. The Guardian's losing money. Many of the others as well. So it may be a very uncertain time for the British newspaper industry.
The whole scandal exposed, or maybe not even exposed because we probably always knew about it, the very intimate relation between media, not only the Murdoch-pers, and politicians. Is that going to change?
Well, inevitably, politicians and journalists spend a lot of time with each other because, we politicians, we live by what they write, and we die by what they write. We live, if we get to go on their television programs, we die if we're never seen. So, of course, that's going to be a close relationship. But what there shouldn't be is the perversion of where the newspapers write stuff or destroy careers or build up careers so as to protect their commercial interests. And that, I think, is what has gone on for too long. And we were just too cowardly about the fact that Rupert Murdoch owned far too much. He had 40% of the newspapers, 80% of the pay TV market, and that's just too much for anybody to have in one set of hands.
Do you think the illegal practices of phone hacking were confined to just the one paper or the Murdoch papers, or is it wide?
I suspect that other newspapers did it, in particular those newspapers that could afford to do it. And sometimes you look at articles in the Mirror and in the Mail on Sunday, and you think, how on earth could they have got that story except by surreptitious, if not illicit means? And if there's evidence, let's go ahead with the evidence. But what's remarkable in the News of the World case is that there is the hard evidence. The police had the evidence in 2006, but chose to do nothing about it. That's the really shocking thing here. As I say, so often it's the cover-up as much as the original criminality, which is the problem.
What would you like to see in terms of regulation of the press? What needs to change?
I think we need to change our cross-media ownership rules in the United Kingdom, so you can't have the preponderance that Rupert Murdoch has enjoyed over the last however many years. I think we ought to have tougher rules about corporate governance in companies, so that Rupert Murdoch saying that this was just 1% of my worldwide empire isn't good enough, because he either means that this could happen again because it's still only 1% of his empire, or else he's saying that he couldn't care less. Either of those I just don't think is good enough. If you had a construction firm and people died, even though it was 1% of the company, you'd still be liable.
David Lee, one of the investigative journalists from The Guardian, has openly admitted that in the past he has used what could be illegal means to, in this case, expose corruption. He thinks it's justified because this was not about affairs, but about true political corruption. Do you think there are circumstances where these means are allowed?
I think robust investigative journalism is really important. It's what keeps, not just politicians, but other industries clean.
Even when they cross a legal line?
Well, I think, if you look at Watergate, I'm sure the journalists involved skirted very close to the edge of what was legal or illegal. And I've not got a problem with that. But of course, when you step over the boundary to where it's illegal, you are in danger of being prosecuted by the authorities. And you have to, that's part of what you have to accept for having done so. Now, the prosecuting authorities might go, well, actually, it isn't in the public interest to pursue a prosecution in this case, which is what I think would normally happen if they were investigating some enormous case of public interest. But what the newspapers have tended to do in the last 20 years, when they've been far more obsessed with celebrities having sex than with real corruption, is that they've tended to confuse the idea of the public interest with what might vaguely interest the public.
Would you like to see regulation of the press like we see with broadcasters in this country, which is a very different case?
Not exactly. The argument for tight regulation of broadcasting is very simply that spectrum has to be allocated, and so it's a scarce resource. And anyway, television tends towards monopoly because it's relatively expensive to make one copy of a program, and then relatively inexpensive to show it to 1,000 people or 2,000 people or 5 million. Whereas with newspapers, it's quite the reverse. Now, I think the Press Complaints Commission hasn't worked. You need to have a body that is far more independent of the newspapers and isn't just run by the newspapers for the newspapers, where there are which has proper teeth that can fine and can sack people for breaking the rules, and where there's a much more coherent code of conduct. And that's what I'd like to see, but I don't think it should be run by government.
Final question. This is about an argument, what I rarely hear in this country, but what people, when the phone hacking scandal was reported in my country, a lot of people said straight away, what about the people who buy the newspaper? Everybody's disgusted about the phone hacking and what happened with Millie Dowler. At the same time, there are millions of people buying the newspaper and they're still being bought. Is there a responsibility for them, or is that really tricky to make a judgment on this thing?
Well, in the end, we're all involved in each other's lives, aren't we? And yes, of course, if we keep on buying newspapers that run stupid celebrity stories and complain about stupid celebrity stories, then we're as stupid as the people who sell it to us. But I think most people in Britain thought that when they were reading stuff, there were stories that had been got legally. And that's all I want. I want the British media to return to their old vocation, which was to bring the truth to light, with courage often, with decency, with determination, but also within the law. It's pretty straightforward, really.
In that sense, was the good decision to scrap the News of the World? It doesn't exist anymore.
A lot of my constituents bought and would doubtless still buy the News of the World today. To my mind, I've never bought it. That's all I can say.
It's not the type of journalism I think you like in this country.
I'm quite happy that you have Heat magazine, you have a wide range of newspapers. I don't think it's for me to determine what other people should be reading, but it is for politicians to decide what should happen when people break the law.